Kang Minho wiped the sweat from his forehead as he watched the mining drones extract rare metals from the rocky surface of Kepler 442b. The red sun cast long shadows across the barren landscape, and the thin atmosphere made every breath feel like work. He had been overseeing this operation for 6 months now, and the routine had become second nature to him. Check the drone systems, monitor the extraction rates, file reports with Earth Command, and try not to think about how far he was from home. The communication device on his belt buzzed with an incoming message. Minho expected another routine update from the supply ship, or maybe news from his sister back on Earth. Instead, the holographic display showed an official seal he had never seen before, a complex geometric pattern that seemed to shift and change as he looked at it. Ambassador Kang Minho of the Terran Republic. The voice spoke in perfect Korean, though something about the pronunciation felt odd. You are hereby summoned to appear before the Galactic Council on Centralis Prime. Your species has been selected for a matter of critical importance to all civilized worlds. Minho stared at the message for several seconds. The Galactic Council had barely acknowledged humanity's existence since first contact 5 years ago. Earth had been granted minor trading rights and permission to establish small colonies on uninhabited worlds, but humans were generally considered too primitive to participate in galactic affairs. Most council species viewed them as barely more advanced than the creatures they had been before, discovering faster-than-light travel. The message continued with coordinates and a departure schedule that would arrive in 3 days. Minho called his second-in-command, a cheerful woman named Kim Yoonji, who had volunteered for the mining assignment to pay off her engineering school debts. Pack everything up, he told her. We're leaving this rock. Problems with the operation? She asked. Already moving to shut down the nearest drilling platform. I don't know yet, Minho replied honestly, but something tells me this is bigger than mining quotas. Meanwhile, halfway across the galaxy, Lee Yuna was conducting her daily research in the Xenobiology lab aboard the Human Research Station, orbiting Proxima Centauri b. Her current project involves studying how Earth bacteria adapted to alien environments, but her real passion was understanding how different species thought and solved problems. She had written 3 papers on alien psychology that the academic community back home found fascinating, even if no one else in the galaxy seemed to care about human research. Yuna's communication system chimed with the same official message that Minho had received. She read it twice, then called her research partner, a quiet man named Park Dong-yun, who had joined the station after serving 10 years in Earth's small but growing space navy. Did you get the council message? She asked. Yes, Dong-yun replied from the station's command center. I've been running diagnostics on our ship systems for the past hour. If the council wants to see humans, we better make sure we can actually get there. What do you think they want? Yuna asked. Dong-yun was quiet for a moment. During his naval service, he had participated in several joint operations with alien vessels, mostly escort duties and cargo protection. The alien crews had been polite, but distant, treating humans like useful but unremarkable partners. In my experience, when someone who usually ignores you suddenly wants your help, it means they're in trouble. On the industrial world of New Busan, Cho Su-min was elbow-deep in the engine compartment of a cargo hauler when her supervisor called her over. Su-min specialized in maintaining the hybrid systems that allowed human ships to interface with alien technology. It was complicated work that required understanding both human engineering principles and alien mathematical concepts that didn't always translate properly. The council wants to see you, her supervisor said, handing her the official message. Pack your tools. The transport leaves tomorrow. Su-min read the message while absently cleaning grease from her hands. She had never expected to hear from the Galactic Council directly. Most of her work involved fixing problems that alien-designed systems couldn't handle, usually because human equipment didn't behave the way alien computers expected it to. Why me? She asked. Because you're the only engineer we have who can make their technology work with ours without exploding, her supervisor replied. And lately, that seems to be exactly what everyone needs. The journey to Centralis Prime took each of them through several jump gates, massive structures that folded space to allow faster-than-light travel. Minho found himself on a transport ship with representatives from dozens of species, all heading to the galactic capital for various official business. The other passengers ignored him completely. which was normal behavior for most aliens when dealing with humans. Yuna and Dong Yun traveled together on their research vessel, spending the journey reviewing everything they knew about current galactic politics. The information was limited since humans were rarely included in important discussions, but they pieced together a picture of growing tension and unusual military movements. Sumin rode on a cargo ship carrying industrial equipment to Council Worlds. She spent most of the trip in the engine room, fascinated by the alien propulsion systems and taking notes on how they might be improved with human modifications. Centralis Prime was unlike anything any of them had seen before. The planet was a perfectly engineered world, with cities that floated in the atmosphere and structures that seemed to grow from the ground like living crystal. The council chambers occupied an entire continent, with buildings designed to accommodate hundreds of different species and their various environmental needs. When the four humans finally met at the designated meeting point, they found themselves in a waiting area filled with some of the most advanced beings in the galaxy. Crystalline creatures that communicated through light patterns stood next to energy beings that barely maintained physical form. Insectoid hive minds clicked and chittered in complex harmonies, while plant-like entities rustled in languages made of chemical sense. "I feel like we're the only ones here who don't belong," Yuna whispered to the others. "Maybe that's the point," Dong Yun replied, watching the other species with the careful attention of someone trained to assess potential threats and allies. A tall, graceful being approached them. Its crystalline body refracted light in beautiful patterns, and when it spoke, the words seemed to come from the air around them rather than from any visible mouth. "I am High Chancellor Veltar of the Althan Collective," it said. "You are the human representatives." "Yes," Minho replied, stepping forward as the most senior diplomat among them. "We received your summons, though we're not sure why." Veltar's light patterns shifted to what might have been confusion or perhaps amusement. "Your species has been selected for a task that requires specific capabilities. Follow me to the briefing chamber." The briefing chamber was enormous, with holographic displays showing star maps and battle formations. Dozens of alien military leaders stood around a central table, their expressions grim, despite the vast differences in their facial structures. The humans were directed to a small section clearly added at the last minute. 3 months ago, Veltar began, long-range sensors detected the return of an enemy we had hoped never to see again. The Void Swarm has awakened from its dormant period and begun consuming worlds on the galactic rim. The holographic display showed images that made all four humans gasp in horror. Entire planets had been stripped down to bare rock, their matter converted into more of the mechanical creatures that moved like a plague across the stars. The swarm ships looked like a combination of insect and machine, with no clear design. Philosophy beyond pure efficiency. "Our combined fleets have engaged the enemy 12 times, continued a insectoid general whose species name was unpronounceable to human tongues. "Each engagement has resulted in complete defeat. The enemy adapts to our tactics faster than we can develop new ones." Dong Yun studied the battle recordings with growing interest. "What exactly do you want from us?" An energy being flickered with what might have been desperation. "Every strategy we employ follows logical principles developed over millennia of civilized warfare. The enemy's adaptive capabilities render these approaches useless within minutes of engagement. Your species," Veltar said, turning to the humans, "has a reputation for approaching problems in ways that other species find difficult to understand, ways that might be called illogical or inefficient." Minho looked at his companions, seeing understanding dawn on their faces. "You want us because we don't think like you do." "Precisely," Veltar replied. "The Council's last hope was mankind, and we are hoping it will work." The war room on Centralis Prime hummed with the quiet desperation of beings who had run out of options. Yuna followed the other humans through corridors lined with displays showing real-time updates from the front lines. Each red dot on the galactic map represented another world consumed by the Void Swarm, and new dots appeared every few hours. General Zeph High of the Nexari hive mind gestured toward a massive holographic table surrounded by alien military commanders. The Nexari looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a computer terminal, with dozens of sensory organs that allowed the entire species to share tactical information instantly. "Your arrival is timely," HFY said, its voice a harmony of clicks and whistles that the translation device rendered into Korean. "We have just received reports of 3 more worlds falling to the swarm." Dong-hyun approached the tactical display and began studying the battle recordings. His naval training had taught him to read fleet movements and combat patterns, but what he saw here defied everything he understood about warfare. The alien fleets moved in perfect geometric formations, their weapons fire coordinated to mathematical precision, their retreat patterns optimized for minimal losses. "This is beautiful," he said, causing several alien heads to turn toward him in confusion. "Beautiful?" asked Commander Vorthek, an energy being whose form flickered between different states of matter. "We have lost over 40 capital ships in the last engagement alone." "No, I mean your tactics are beautiful," Dong-hyun explained. "Perfect formations, optimal firing solutions, textbook fleet coordination. It's like watching a ballet." The alien commanders exchanged what might have been glances if they had possessed eyes that functioned in ways humans could understand. "Is this not how civilized species conduct warfare?" asked a crystalline officer whose name translated roughly to strategist of the 17th calculation. Yuna stepped forward, her xenobiology training helping her read the subtle emotional cues that most humans missed when dealing with aliens. "May we see how the swarm responds to your attacks?" The tactical display shifted to show swarm movements during the most recent battle. Yuna watched with growing fascination as the mechanical creatures began each engagement with seemingly random patterns, then rapidly adapted to mirror and counter every alien strategy within minutes of first contact. "They learn from you," she said, "but not the way a student learns from a teacher. They copy you, then find ways to do what you do but better." Suman had been examining the technical specifications of swarm technology displayed on secondary screens around the room. "Their ships don't follow any design philosophy I recognize," she said. "Human engineers build redundancy into systems, multiple ways to accomplish the same task. These things seem to have exactly one way to do everything, but they do it perfectly. Efficiency is their primary directive," confirmed HFY. "Every captured swarm unit shows the same characteristic: complete optimization for their assigned function." Minho studied the faces around the room, reading the subtle signs of defeat in beings whose species had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years. "How long have you been fighting wars the same way?" "Our current tactical doctrines have been refined over approximately 4,000 standard years," replied the strategist of the 17th calculation. "They represent the accumulated wisdom of dozens of species and countless conflicts." "And the swarm has been around longer than that?" "Much longer," Veltar said, its crystalline form dimming slightly. "They first appeared approximately 12,000 years ago, consumed several hundred systems, then went dormant. We assumed they had been destroyed or had moved beyond our galaxy." Dong-hyun started laughing, a sound that seemed to disturb several of the alien commanders. "You've been preparing to fight the last war while they've been preparing to fight you." "Explain this concept," demanded General HFY. "You've spent 4,000 years perfecting your tactics," Dong-hyun said, "which means you've become predictable. The swarm doesn't need to be creative, they just need to be better at doing what you already do." Yuna nodded enthusiastically. "It's like playing chess against someone who memorizes every possible game. You can't win by playing chess better than them." "Then how do you propose we win?" asked Vorthek. "You don't play chess," Suman said quietly. "You play something else entirely." The alien commanders fell silent, processing this suggestion. For species that had built their entire civilization on logical progression and systematic improvement, the idea of abandoning proven methods seemed almost incomprehensible. "Your species," Veltar said slowly, "approaches problems differently than ours." "Very differently," Minho confirmed. "Human military history is full of victories won by people who refuse to follow the rules." Over the next several hours, the humans were given access to detailed records of every engagement with the swarm. They studied battle plans, ship specifications, and tactical analyses that represented the best thinking of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. "Look at this," Yuna said, pointing to a pattern in the data. "Every time you try a new strategy, you test it in simulation first, right?" "Of course," replied HFY. proper planning prevents unnecessary losses. But the swarm has been monitoring your communications, Dongyun observed. They know what you're planning before you do it. Suman pulled up technical schematics showing swarm communication networks. They share information instantly across their entire fleet through quantum entanglement. When one unit learns something, they all learn it. So by the time you implement your carefully planned strategy, Minho said, they've already figured out how to counter it. The aliens absorbed this information with the careful attention of beings who were accustomed to solving problems through analysis and logical deduction. But the solution the humans were suggesting required something that most alien species found difficult: deliberately choosing inefficient methods. "You propose that we abandon tactical planning entirely?" asked the strategist of the 17th. "Calculation." "Not abandon it," Yuna explained. "Use it as a weapon. Plan things you don't intend to do. Make them waste time adapting to strategies you never implement." "Deception," Vortex said, the word carrying undertones of confusion in its energy patterns. "Your species considers this honorable?" "Our species considers it necessary," Dongyun replied. "Honor doesn't mean much if you're extinct." The discussion continued through several cycles as alien military leaders struggled with concepts that seemed to contradict everything they understood about proper warfare. The idea of deliberately choosing suboptimal tactics, of wasting resources on fake operations, of planning to fail in order to succeed later, all of these approaches required a fundamental shift in thinking. "There is another problem," HFY finally said. "Even if we accept your methods, our forces are not trained for this type of warfare. Our crews expect logical orders and systematic approaches." "Then you'll need different crews," Suman said. "Mixed crews. Aliens who can learn to think like humans, and humans who understand your technology." "The Council has never authorized joint species military operations," Veltar pointed out. "The Council has never faced extinction before," Minho replied simply. As the hours passed, the humans began sketching out preliminary ideas for a new kind of warfare. Instead of massive fleets engaging in formal battle lines, they proposed small, unpredictable units that would act independently. Rather than overwhelming firepower, they suggested confusion and misdirection. Where alien doctrine called for efficiency, human thinking demanded beautiful, chaotic inefficiency. "Your methods seem designed to create maximum uncertainty," observed General HFY. "Exactly," Yuna said. "If we don't know what we're going to do next, how can they adapt to it?" The meeting finally ended when reports arrived of another world falling to the swarm, as the alien commanders dispersed to consider the human proposals. Veltar approached the four humans privately. "What you suggest goes against millennia of civilized warfare," the High Chancellor said. "But then, the swarm is not civilized, and our civilization may not survive if we continue fighting them as we always have. So what happens now?" Minho asked. "Now," Veltar replied, "we find out if the Council's last hope was mankind, and we discover whether it works." 3 weeks after the emergency council session, Donghyun found himself standing on the bridge of the CNS Harmony, a ship that represented everything the alien military establishment considered wrong with the new approach. The vessel was a patchwork of technologies from 6 different species, crewed by volunteers who had agreed to abandon everything they knew about proper military procedure. The crew was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Nexari hive mind fragments worked alongside individual Althan crystal singers, while Vorthak energy beings attempted to coordinate with solid matter species they had never directly interacted with before. And scattered throughout the ship were humans, serving as what Minho had diplomatically termed tactical advisors, but what everyone understood to be chaos coordinators. "Fleet status report," Dongyun called out, as the mixed crew prepared for their first engagement with the Void Swarm. Lieutenant Kyle, a young Althan whose crystalline structure flickered with nervous energy, consulted his displays. 15 ships. Ready for departure, sir. Each vessel carries a mixed crew as requested. All captains report their crews are confused but willing to follow orders." Yuna looked up from her position at the xenobiology station, which had been converted into something the humans called a behavioral analysis center. She had spent the past 3 weeks teaching alien crew members to recognize and deliberately create unpredictable patterns in their own behavior. "The psychological profiles are as ready as they can be," she reported. "Most of our alien crew members are experiencing significant stress from being asked to act irrationally. But they're learning." Suman's voice crackled over the communication system from the engineering section. "Weapon systems are operating at 60% efficiency, which is exactly what we want. I've introduced random delays and power fluctuations into every ship in the fleet. Our own computers can't predict when our weapons will fire." The target was a swarm scout force that had been probing the defenses of the Kepler Nebula, a region rich in the rare materials needed for advanced space travel. Standard Council doctrine would have called for a coordinated assault with overwhelming firepower designed to eliminate the enemy force quickly and efficiently. Instead, the human-led fleet was about to try something that had never been attempted in the history of galactic warfare, a retreat that was actually an attack. "All ships, this is Fleet Commander Dong Hyun," he announced over the fleet communication channel. "Remember your training. Do not, under any circumstances, attempt to win this battle. Your job is to confuse the enemy so badly that they defeat themselves." The response from the alien captains was a mixture of acknowledgement and barely concealed bewilderment. Captain Thrental of the Nexari Vessel Collective thought had spent the previous week learning to give orders that contradicted each other. Commander Velkaris of the Althan ship Crystal Song had practiced deliberately failing at tasks she could normally accomplish perfectly. As the fleet approached the nebula, long-range sensors detected the swarm force exactly where intelligence reports had predicted. 43 mechanical vessels arranged in a perfect sphere formation, their adaptive algorithms already beginning to analyze the approaching council ships. "Fleet scatter pattern 7, Dongyun ordered. "Execute retreat, immediately." What happened next would have been considered cowardice by traditional military standards. The council ships broke formation and fled in 15 different directions, their flight paths seemingly random and their communication channels filled with panicked transmissions about system failures and equipment malfunctions. The swarm force adapted instantly, dividing their ships to pursue the fleeing vessels while maintaining optimal pursuit curves designed to intercept each target with maximum efficiency. Their quantum communication network shared tactical data in real time, allowing them to coordinate the pursuit with mechanical precision. But as the chase continued, the swarm began encountering problems their adaptive algorithms weren't designed to handle. The fleeing council ships didn't behave like ships in retreat. Some vessels would suddenly stop and fire at empty space before resuming their flight. Others would deliberately fly into asteroid fields that should have been avoided. Several ships appeared to suffer cascading system failures that somehow made them more dangerous rather than less. Yuna monitored swarm communications from her station, watching as their quantum network began to show signs of strain. "They're trying to adapt to 15 different tactical patterns simultaneously," she reported. "But our patterns aren't actually patterns. They're just random actions disguised as tactics." The breakthrough came when the CNS Harmony appeared to suffer a complete power failure while being pursued by 3 swarm vessels. The ship drifted helplessly as the mechanical predators closed in for what should have been an easy kill. The swarm ships adjusted their formation to optimal firing positions and prepared to eliminate their target. At the precise moment when the enemy was most confident of victory, Suman's modifications triggered throughout the Harmony's systems. Weapons that had appeared to be offline suddenly powered up with irregular energy outputs that the swarm's analysis couldn't predict. Engines that had seemed dead roared to life with thrust patterns that violated basic physics. Shield systems activated in configurations that made no mathematical sense. The 3 pursuing swarm ships found themselves facing an opponent that seemed to operate outside the normal rules of space combat. Their adaptive systems, designed to counter logical tactics, struggled to process weapons that fired at random intervals with unpredictable effects. Within minutes, all 3 swarm vessels had been destroyed, not by superior firepower, but by their own confusion. Their targeting systems had been overwhelmed, trying to track a ship that moved in ways that defied tactical analysis. Similar scenes played out across the nebula as other council ships implemented variations of the same strategy. The Althan vessel, Crystal Song, pretended to surrender while simultaneously launching missiles that appeared to be malfunctioning, but somehow hit their targets anyway. The Nexari ship collective thought split its hive mind into competing factions that gave contradictory orders, creating a combat pattern that was impossible to predict because the crew itself didn't know what they would do next. The most spectacular success came from Commander Vorthek's energy-based vessel, the Stellar Dance. Vorthek had learned to deliberately destabilize his own energy matrix, causing his ship to phase in and out of normal space in completely random intervals. The pursuing swarm ships couldn't maintain target locks on a vessel that spent half its time existing in dimensions their sensors couldn't detect. When the battle ended 2 hours later, the results were unprecedented in the history of warfare against the Void Swarm. 37 enemy vessels had been destroyed with the loss of only 2 Council ships, both of which had been evacuated before their deliberately induced system failures became fatal. But more importantly, for the first time since the swarm's return, their adaptive network had failed. Intercepted communications showed that the mechanical minds were struggling to process tactical data that contradicted their fundamental understanding of how space combat should function. "They're learning the wrong lessons," Yuna observed as she analyzed the post-battle communications intercepts. "Every time they adapt to one of our fake tactics, they become less capable of dealing with our real ones." Minho joined them on the bridge as the fleet regrouped near the nebula's edge. Reports were already coming in from across the galaxy as news of the engagement spread through diplomatic channels. For the first time since the crisis began, a council force had not only survived contact with the swarm, but had actually won a significant victory. "How do you feel about being the first humans to command a galactic fleet?" Minho asked. Dongyun looked around the bridge at his mixed crew, watching as Althan crystal singers attempted to learn human curse words, while Nexari hive mind fragments practiced disagreeing with themselves. "I feel like we've just taught the galaxy's most advanced civilizations how to be beautifully incompetent. The fleet commanders are requesting permission to engage the main swarm force," reported Lieutenant Kyle. "Not yet," Dongyun replied. "First, we need to teach the rest of the Council Navy how to lose properly. Because if today proved anything, it's that sometimes the best way to win is to be so bad at fighting that your enemy can't figure out how to beat you." Sumin's voice came over the communication system from engineering. "I'm reading massive quantum network activity from the swarms, main fleet. They're trying to analyze what happened here." "Let them analyze," Yuna said with satisfaction. "The more they try to understand chaos, the more chaotic they become." As the Harmony set course for Centralis Prime to report on their impossible victory, the 4 humans reflected on how much had changed since that first desperate meeting with the Galactic Council. They had been called the Council's last hope, and now it seemed that hope might actually work. Word of the impossible victory at Kepler Nebula spread through the galactic communication networks faster than the Council's official reports could be filed. Within days, every species in the galaxy knew that a small fleet of mixed crews had achieved what the finest military minds had declared impossible. They had forced a Void Swarm retreat. Yuna stood in the Council's main briefing chamber, watching as representatives from dozens of species studied tactical recordings of the battle, with expressions that ranged from amazement to complete bewilderment. The chamber itself had been reconfigured to accommodate the sudden flood of military observers who wanted to understand how the humans had accomplished their victory. "The enemy's adaptive network appears to have suffered a systematic breakdown," reported General Zeph High to the assembled crowd. "For the first time in recorded history, swarm vessels abandoned an engagement while suffering minimal losses." Admiral Kreshata of the Vorthak Confederacy flickered through several energy states before stabilizing enough to speak. "Our analysis suggests that the swarm's quantum communication system was overwhelmed by contradictory tactical data. They could not adapt to strategies that had no logical foundation." Minho watched the discussion from the human delegation area, noting how quickly alien military doctrine was being rewritten. Species that had spent millennia perfecting their tactical approaches were suddenly eager to learn concepts like strategic incompetence and organized chaos. The transformation was remarkable to observe. Crystalline Althan strategists were practicing how to make deliberate mistakes in their perfect mathematical calculations. Nexari hive minds were learning to fragment their collective consciousness, to create internal contradictions. Even the plant-like Dendari were experimenting with growth patterns that violated their natural optimization instincts. "The preliminary results are encouraging," announced High Chancellor Veltar as the briefing session concluded. 7 different species have reported successful implementation of human tactical concepts in simulation exercises. But Dongyun knew that simulation victories were only the beginning. The real test would come when the full Council fleet faced the main swarm force, which intelligence reports suggested was gathering near the galactic core for a massive offensive that could consume hundreds of worlds. Suman had spent the past week working with alien engineers to modify their weapons systems according to human principles. Instead of optimizing for maximum efficiency, they were deliberately introducing variables that would make their equipment unpredictable. Laser weapons that changed frequency randomly, missile guidance systems that occasionally ignored their targets to pursue decoys, shield generators that failed and restarted according to patterns that even their operators couldn't predict. The hardest part, she explained to a group of Althan engineers, is making technology that works badly on purpose without making it completely useless. The alien engineers struggled with this concept more than any other aspect of human military thinking. Their entire technological philosophy was based on continuous improvement and systematic optimization. The idea of deliberately making their equipment less efficient seemed to violate fundamental principles of engineering. But the results spoke for themselves. Test engagements against captured swarm units showed that unpredictable technology was nearly impossible for the mechanical minds to counter effectively. Weapons that behaved differently each time they fired couldn't be adapted to, and defensive systems that operated according to chaotic principles couldn't be analyzed and overcome. The breakthrough came when Yuna proposed the most ambitious deception in galactic history. Instead of simply confusing individual swarm units, they would attempt to corrupt the entire enemy network by feeding it false information on such a massive scale that the artificial intelligence would essentially suffer a mechanical nervous breakdown. The swarm's greatest strength is their instant communication, she explained to the assembled fleet commanders. Every unit shares tactical data with every other unit in real time. But what if we could make that sharing work against them? The plan required coordination on a scale that had never been attempted. Every ship in the Council fleet would participate in an elaborate deception designed to make the swarm believe that multiple different battles were occurring simultaneously across dozens of star systems. Minho coordinated the diplomatic aspects of the operation, ensuring that every species understood their role in what military historians would later call the Great Galactic Misdirection. The plan called for fake retreats that were actually advances, distress signals that were actually attack plans, and surrender offers that concealed the largest military operation in galactic history. Remember, he told the assembled fleet commanders, during the final briefing, the enemy will be monitoring all our communications. Every message you send, every order you give, every status report you file must be part of the deception. You're not just fighting a battle. You're performing in a play where the audience can kill you if they figure out the plot. The operation began with what appeared to be a catastrophic defeat. Council forces across 7 different star systems simultaneously reported massive swarm attacks and began broadcasting desperate calls for reinforcement. Emergency protocols activated throughout civilized space as military units rushed to defend worlds that seemed to be under immediate threat. The swarm's quantum network absorbed this information eagerly, their adaptive algorithms analyzing dozens of simultaneous engagements and adjusting their tactics to optimize performance across multiple theaters of operation. For the first time since their return, the mechanical minds seemed to be facing the kind of systematic warfare they were designed to counter. But as the engagement continued, subtle inconsistencies began to accumulate in the swarm's tactical analysis. Fleet movements that appeared logical individually made no sense when viewed as part of a larger pattern. Distress calls contained technical details that contradicted sensor readings. Emergency evacuation procedures seemed to be moving civilian populations toward danger rather than away from it. Dongyun monitored the deception from the Bridge of the Harmony, now serving as the flagship of the largest fleet ever assembled by the Galactic Council. Around him, alien crew members who had spent weeks learning to think irrationally were implementing the most complex military operation in their species' histories. Phase 2 is initiating across all sectors, reported Lieutenant Kale, his crystalline structure flickering with excitement. The Nexari hive fleets are beginning their false retreats. Vorthak energy squadrons confirm they are suffering simulated system failures on schedule, added Commander Velkaris from her position at the tactical station. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. While the swarm focused their attention on analyzing fake battles across the galaxy, the real Council fleet was approaching their main staging area through a route that intelligence suggested would be completely undefended. Suman's voice crackled over the communication system from the engineering section. Enemy network activity is increasing exponentially. Their quantum communications are handling more data than our computers can track. How much more? Yuna asked from her behavioral analysis station. About 3,000% above normal operational levels, Sumin replied. If they were biological minds, I'd say they were having panic attacks. The climax came when the Council fleet finally revealed itself at the edge of the swarm's main staging area. Hundreds of ships appeared simultaneously, their weapons powered, and their defensive systems active. But instead of immediately attacking, they began implementing the most elaborate military comedy routine in galactic history. Council vessels accidentally collided with each other, causing chain reactions that somehow damaged nearby swarm positions. Weapons systems malfunctioned and fired at empty space, only to have their missed shots ricochet off asteroids and strike enemy targets. Entire squadrons became lost and wandered behind swarm lines, where they proceeded to cause massive damage, while apparently trying to find their way back to the main fleet. The swarm's response was unlike anything in their recorded history. Their quantum network, already overwhelmed by processing false information from dozens of fake battles, began experiencing cascade failures as it tried to analyze tactics that violated every principle of logical warfare. Individual swarm units started behaving erratically, some ignoring obvious threats, while others attacked empty space. Their perfect formation discipline broke down as different units received contradictory tactical updates from their shared consciousness. For the first time since their creation, the mechanical minds were experiencing something that could only be described as confusion. Their network is fragmenting, Yuna reported with amazement. Different sectors of their fleet are operating on incompatible tactical assumptions. The battle that followed was less a traditional engagement than a demonstration of how chaos could defeat order. Swarm vessels that had seemed invincible when operating as a coordinated whole found themselves isolated and vulnerable when their communication network failed to provide coherent guidance. When the Harmony's main guns finally opened fire on the swarm command ship, 6 months after the victory at the Core Worlds, Sumin stood in her new office overlooking the sprawling campus of the Galactic Council's Department of Adaptive Warfare. Through the crystalline windows, she could see training grounds where alien military units practiced the art of deliberate failure under the guidance of human instructors. The transformation of galactic military doctrine had happened faster than anyone thought possible. Species that had spent millennia perfecting rigid tactical systems were now eagerly learning concepts like productive incompetence and strategic confusion. The Althan Collective had established an entire academy dedicated to teaching their crystal singers how to deliberately introduce flaws into their perfect mathematical harmonies. Department Director Cho, her assistant announced, using the title that still felt strange to Sumin's ears. The morning briefing is ready to begin. Sumin made her way to the main conference room where representatives from 7 different species waited to review the latest developments in chaos-based warfare. The meeting included Admiral Kreshta of the Vorthak, whose energy form now flickered in deliberately unpredictable patterns, and General Zeph Hai of the Nexari, whose hive mind had learned to argue with itself in productive ways. Status report on the new Chaos Fleet formations, Sumin requested, as she took her seat at the head of the conference table. Commander Velkaris, the Althan officer who had served aboard the Harmony during the first engagement with the Swarm, activated the holographic display. 12 mixed species squadrons are now operational, each trained in human tactical principles. Fleet exercises show a 97% success rate against conventional opposition forces. The Nexari Collective has completed integration of fragmentary thinking protocols into our hive mind structure, added General Zeph Hai. Our units can now operate with productive internal contradictions while maintaining overall mission coherence, the I. Briefing continued with reports from across the galaxy. The plant-like Dendari had developed growth strategies that deliberately created inefficient but unpredictable defensive positions. The crystalline Althan were experimenting with communication harmonies that carried multiple contradictory messages simultaneously. Even the energy-based Vorthak had learned to destabilize their matrix patterns in ways that made their movements impossible to predict. Meanwhile, across the administrative complex, Yuna was conducting her daily seminar on xenopsychological warfare in the Council's new Center for Cognitive Asymmetry. Her classroom was filled with some of the galaxy's most brilliant military minds, all struggling to master the fundamentally human concept of thinking irrationally on purpose. The key principle, she explained to her mixed-species audience, is that rationality itself can become a weakness when facing an opponent who expects logical behavior. A young Nexari fragment raised what might have been considered a hand if it had been attached to a more conventional body. Professor Lee, how does one learn to be irrational without becoming genuinely dysfunctional? By understanding that apparent. Irrationality can serve rational purposes, Yuna replied. When humans act unpredictably, we're not abandoning logic. We're using a different kind of logic that considers psychological and social factors alongside purely tactical ones. The discussion that followed would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Species that had never questioned their fundamental approaches to problem-solving were now actively seeking ways to think differently. The Althan students were learning to introduce deliberate errors into their calculations. The Nexari fragments were practicing individualistic thinking that contradicted their collective instincts. In the military complex on the other side of Centralis Prime, Dong-Yun was reviewing fleet exercises from his position as Supreme Commander of Unconventional Forces. The title was new, created specifically to acknowledge humanity's unique contribution to galactic defense. His current project involved training the most ambitious military formation in galactic history, a combined fleet representing all major council species, organized around principles of controlled chaos and productive confusion. The results exceeded every expectation. Admiral Park, his aide announced, the council session is ready to begin. Dong-Hyun made his way to the council chambers, where the quarterly military review was scheduled to take place. The chamber itself had been redesigned to accommodate the new collaborative approach to galactic governance. Instead of rigid hierarchical seating arrangements, representatives from different species mixed freely in discussion groups that changed configuration throughout each session. High Chancellor Veltar called the session to order with a musical harmony that deliberately included several discordant notes. Even the ceremonial protocols had been modified to reflect the new philosophy that perfect order might not always be the optimal approach. The quarterly security report, Veltar announced, shows continued success of our new defensive doctrines. No hostile forces have successfully adapted to our chaos-based tactics. The report that followed demonstrated just how completely galactic military thinking had been transformed. Traditional concepts like overwhelming firepower and tactical superiority had been supplemented with new metrics like confusion generation capacity and adaptive resistance effectiveness. Long-range monitoring stations report no significant swarm activity beyond the galactic rim, Admiral Kreshta added, her energy form pulsing with patterns that would have been considered random 6 months earlier, but now represented a sophisticated form of encrypted communication. Across the complex, Minho was conducting his own review session in his role as strategic advisor for unconventional solutions. His office had become the unofficial center for addressing problems that seemed impossible to solve through traditional methods. The trade dispute between the Dendari Collective and the Althan Crystal Singers has reached an impasse, his assistant reported. Both species are requesting human mediation. Minho smiled as he reviewed the details of the disagreement. The Dendari wanted to establish growing colonies in Althan crystal formations, while the Althan considered such integration to be aesthetically unacceptable. Traditional diplomatic approaches had failed because both species were approaching the problem from completely incompatible philosophical frameworks. Schedule a joint session, he decided. We'll teach them to argue productively by having them deliberately argue about the wrong things first. The technique had proven remarkably effective in dozens of similar situations. By encouraging species to engage in controlled conflict over minor issues, human mediators could help them develop communication patterns that worked when addressing more serious problems. As the day progressed, reports arrived from across the galaxy confirming the success of the new approaches. Scientific research stations were making breakthrough discoveries by deliberately pursuing lines of investigation that seemed pointless. Diplomatic corps were resolving centuries-old conflicts by encouraging the involved parties to focus on productive disagreement rather than forced consensus. But perhaps the most significant development was occurring in the galaxy's educational systems. Young beings from every species were learning to question fundamental assumptions that their cultures had accepted for millennia. Althan children were being taught that perfect mathematical harmony might not always be the optimal solution. Nexari offspring were learning to value individual thinking alongside collective wisdom. Vorthak energy forms were exploring the benefits of deliberate instability. The transformation went beyond military applications. Art, science, philosophy, and even basic problem-solving were being revolutionized by the introduction of human concepts like creative destruction and productive failure. The most interesting development, Yuna reported during the evening staff meeting, is that we're seeing the emergence of genuinely new forms of intelligence. Species are developing cognitive capabilities they never had before. Any signs of negative consequences? Minho asked. Some resistance from traditional factions, Suman replied. There are groups within several species that consider our approaches to be fundamentally dangerous to civilized order. Are they wrong? Dongyun asked with a grin. Probably not, Yuna admitted. What we're teaching really is dangerous to the old order. But the old order couldn't survive the swarm, and it might not survive whatever comes next. As if summoned by their discussion, an emergency alert arrived from the Deep Space Monitoring Network. A new signal had been detected from beyond the galactic rim, but this time, it wasn't the swarm. Something else was approaching civilized space, and initial analysis suggested it was far older and more powerful than anything the galaxy had encountered before. New contact, the alert read. Entity appears to be artificial intelligence of unknown origin. Preliminary communication suggests it demands immediate compliance with something it calls the Universal Order Protocol. The four humans exchanged glances that mixed excitement with concern. They had saved the galaxy once by teaching it to embrace chaos. Now it seemed they would have the opportunity to discover whether their methods could work against an entirely different kind of threat. Emergency Council Session? Minho asked. Emergency Council Session? Donghyun confirmed. As they made their way to the council chambers,